everyone, my name is Maggie Wright and I'm doing Case Study 2C from the Media Ethics Issues and Cases textbook. Case Study 2C is Dr. Dolittle Not Debunking Fake Animal Stories by Lee Wilkins at the University of Missouri. So we all know that people love stories about animals. These stories often make the news at both the local and national level, and they a lot of times go viral. Animals are also the focus of many advertising campaigns like the Coca-Cola Polar Bears, the Budweiser Clydesdales, and so many more. Not to mention all of the movies about animals that are always a big hit. These nice animal stories are not always true though. At the peak of COVID-19, all of the chaos that surrounded 2020, many animal stories began to circulate the internet, like swans and dolphins returning to the polluted canals of Venice, the Russian President Vladimir Putin allowing African tigers to roam the streets of Moscow to help enforce stay-at-home orders, and elephants roaming through a Chinese village getting drunk on corn wine and passing out in the square, all of which are definitely not true, and I know I personally remember stories like this. Natasha Daly, a reporter for National Geographic, has been hard at work to debunk these online stories. Daly actually covered the factual story of a tiger at the Bronx Zoo that tested positive for COVID-19. Fortunately, Daly was not alone in doing this, and she received some online support. One supporter being Paulo Ordoveza, a web developer and image verification expert. Ordoveza says greed and virality is what fuels these false stories, and some people have just become too concerned with having a social media presence and sometimes the high of getting so many retweets, likes, and shares is just too much for people to resist, basically. For instance, I'm going to butcher this, Kavari Ganapathy Ahuja retweeted about the swans. It was like her original thing, returning her original retweet about the swans returning to the polluted canals in Venice got more than 1 million likes, which was a personal record for her, and she did not want to delete it. She said that she had composed the tweets combining photos she saw online on social media, and she was unaware that the swans lived in Venice before the pandemic. The tweet was just something that brought me joy in gloomy times, she told National Geographic, which is something that I think we can all relate to. However, for others, it was a need to return order to 2020, a year full of sheer chaos. The idea that nature was returning to normal, which is what a lot of these fake animal stories were rooted in, gives people this false sense that nature has the ability to rise above the pandemic and COVID-19. Daly says she believes it is her responsibility as a journalist to tell readers the truth, even if they push back against her debunking efforts. These false stories can have an impact on conservation efforts, Daly says, when humans have such a huge impact on ecosystems to a point they cannot recover with human intervention. These false stories give the impression that efforts are not necessary because life will just find a way to survive and can ultimately fix itself. Daly explains she takes pride in telling the real animal stories. She says, I always want to empower readers to come away from it feeling like there's actually something they can do in their own lives to protect animals. Chapter 2 of our textbook outlines ethical news values, one of which being equity, which is defined as seeking justice for all involved in controversial issues and treating all subjects and sources equally. Equity also ensures that all points of view are considered and expands the journalistic norms of telling both sides of the story to telling all sides of the story. I think this is something that Dally was trying to accomplish, and she was making sure that the audience got the whole truth about the animal stories. I also think it's important to note that she treats animals just like she would humans and make sure that the stories get told about them are true, and because they obviously can't tell these stories themselves. Tenacity is another ethical news value that Dally exhibits. Tenacity is described as knowing when a story is important enough to require additional efforts. As I previously stated, it was important for her to put in that extra effort to debunk these false stories because they were very misleading, and they were given the impression that nature could just fix itself without human intervention, and there was basically nothing that could be done on society's end to, help nature return back to normal. Dally also was making sure that she set the record straight with all of these stories and that they were accurate. Our textbook defines accuracy as using the correct facts and the right words and putting things into context. It also says that journalists need to be as independent as they can when framing stories and to be aware of their own biases. I think what happened a lot with these false stories is that people were just not stopping and thinking about what they were doing before they posted it or retweeted it or, liked it, commented, whatever. Also, people were not verifying that it was true before liking or reposting. Our textbook gives a great checklist of how to avoid spreading fake news, a term that kind of became popular last year. One of the first points is just to simply check your sources and look them up before you post or publish. Another great point is to ask yourself, are there other reputable news sources reporting on this story? And to kind of take that extra effort before you repost or post something to make sure that there are other news sources posting on it and not just taking the first thing you see and running with it. I think these two alone would have avoided a lot of these stories from circulating the internet like they did. Selective perception could have also came into play here. Selective perception is basically how we can all look at or read the same thing, but because of our alliances, we all view it differently or can take something totally different away from it than someone else. I think people just wanting to take something good, make something good out of 2020 is what made a lot of people share these stories. They kind of immediately saw it, believed it was true, and it brought them some joy in some pretty dark times, and just decided to share it, which is understandable. An ethical question that can be asked is, do these false stories harm readers and viewers? I think we can turn to the big three here and kind of see what they would think. Aristotle believed that virtue lies in the mean of deficiency and excess, which basically means good ethical decisions lie in the middle ground. I think he would say, not sharing these stories is not allowing viewers to have something happy to come out of the year, but also they give that false sense that nature can return back to normal without human intervention. So I feel like he would say, share the story, but maybe say, this doesn't come from a reputable source, so just kind of take it with a grain of salt. Immanuel Kant's big idea is the categorical imperative, which is that morality is already embedded in our brains. If it's immoral, it will always be immoral, no matter what the situation is, and vice versa. If it's moral, it's always moral. He says, act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should be a universal law, which is basically just a very confusing and fancy way of saying act how you want everyone else to act, which is more of a holistic approach to making ethical decisions than an exchange like Aristotle. I think that Kant would agree with Dally that these false stories should not be shared at all. because they're not true, and they shouldn't be spread because essentially they're lying, and lying is immoral. Our last philosopher of the big three is John Stuart Mill, and his big idea is utilitarianism. He says good consequences come from good actions. The consequences of actions are important. Mill believed that whatever is the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the answer. Mill also believed that actions are right in proportion to their ability to produce happiness. So Mill would be kind of an outlier in this situation. I think he would say, share the stories regardless of if the information is true or not, or if they're misleading, because that's what's going to make the most people happy. I also think that he would not really agree with Dowley's efforts to debunk these stories because they would not be producing happiness and would really just be upsetting people who had been given this false sense of nature healing itself and kind of taking away that joy that they found in 2020. So I have a question for you guys. What role do these social media platforms play in this? And should these stories be marked as misinformation? So the first choice would be, are you siding with Aristotle? Maybe they should mark them as misinformation, but not take them down. Or do you side more with Mill and say, leave them up, don't mark them as misinformation, they're bringing people happiness, let them just believe it? Or do you side more with Kant and saying, don't just mark them with misinformation, take them down, they're false stories? So yes, that will be your question for you to answer. Thank you.